Welcome to Trinity College in the beautiful long room. So it's the first time I've ever done an event in here, and it feels very special. So tonight's event, Reconstructing the Past, is part of Probe, which is Uncovering Research at Trinity College, which is part of the EU Researchers' Night, which is taking place in cities all over Europe. And the idea is that universities are opening their doors. I think Trinity perhaps has quite open doors in general because we're here right in the centre of the city, and we have rooms like this which are visited by plenty of tourists every day. So, but maybe we're a bit more open today. And the event this evening, we have 4 different speakers who are talking in different ways about reconstructing the past. So we're going to be progressing from the origins of the universe to the origins of life on this planet, to the origins of humans, and then to history itself. So through these 4 talks, we're going to have very much a whistle-stop tour through basically the whole universe. So hopefully that's enough for you. First up this evening, we have Professor Ian Sanders, who is a geologist, and he works on meteorites and also the first 5 million years of the universe. So it's a great pleasure.
Of the solar system.
Of the solar system. Okay, sorry. Yes, it is. It is. Okay, so only the solar system. Sorry about the disappointment there. So if you want to come up here and take a seat.
So is this slide? Oh, great. Yeah. Well, it's an enormous privilege to be in this room, because this room was built like this eventually by 1860. 1860 was the year after Charles Darwin's Origin of Species was published. It was a period in history, a most remarkable period called the Enlightenment. Just a few years before that, the museum building, the beautiful museum building, was built. And the Enlightenment, the Age of Enlightenment, had many dimensions, but most importantly, it was development of science and people looking at evidence to figure out how things got the way they did. And that is what drives research still today, figuring out how things got the way they did. Now, about 20 years ago, I got interested in meteorites. And they are fascinating because they tell us a lot about how the Earth was formed. So if I begin, I have a meteorite.
You've brought something with you, I think, yes?
Yeah, here. See them? Yeah, it's very little, and you won't be able to see it. And there's no point in passing it around because it's so gloomy, you still won't be able to see it. So I'm going to describe it for you. It's a thin slice sawn through a meteorite, that's flat. And when I look at it, I can see little grains. Eva might be able to see them. Yes. Little grains. Some of them are silvery. They're made of metal, and they're about the size of sand grains. And the rest is brown. It's rocky stuff. And this is the stuff that common meteorites are made of. A mixture like sandstone, but with metal grains and little rocky bits in between. And the rocky bits are particularly interesting because they're not like ordinary sand grains. They were once molten drops. So there they are, mixed together. Now, this stuff comes from space. Whereabouts does it come from? Well, that was a big question, but in the last 30 or 40 years, the evidence has gradually built up that they come from the asteroid belt. Now, where's that? Well, if the sun's in the middle, planets orbit around it, all in the same plane, going in the same direction. And we go from Mercury, Venus, Earth, you all know this, and then Mars, and then there's a gap before you get to Jupiter. But in that gap, that's where the asteroids are. There's a whole lot of small planets and broken planets and rubble and dust, muck. And it's bits from the asteroid belt that somehow get sent earthwards, and we pick them up. And we know this because people have taken photographs of incoming meteorites. They make a fireball. If it's photographed from 2 places at once, it's possible to work out the exact trajectory. And when you project back into space to see where that was, sure enough, it fits in with the idea that they come from the asteroid belt. So here we are looking at bits of asteroid. This mixture of metal and little molten droplets. So something I'm going to tell you next is very important. If I were to analyze this, mix it all up, the metal and the grains, mix them together and analyze them chemically to see what's there, it would turn out to be the same as the chemistry of the sun. Now, that's not quite true because the sun's got lots of hydrogen and helium, but they're gases, so they're not going to hang around in a bit of rock. But if you take the gases away, they're identical. This rock and the sun. Now, that's amazing because this is from out in the asteroid belt. The sun's in the middle. But remarkably, it fits with a hypothesis that was established early in the period of Enlightenment by Laplace, French astronomer and mathematician. And he figured that because the planets were all going around in the same direction in a plane, that they came out of a disk of dust that was going around the sun. And so this composition, the sun and this, has the chemical composition of that original material that made the sun in the middle and the dust going around it, which eventually aggregated to make first small planets and then bigger ones as they got together, and eventually made the planets that we have today, including our Earth. So overall, our Earth would have the same chemistry as this stuff. And you might be interested to know that we think the core of the Earth is made of iron metal, because the little bits of iron in this would melt, and they wouldn't mix with the silicate part, the rocky part. They would form, like oil in water, they would separate out, and the heavy metal would go to the core. Okay, so here we have it then. This material is the material from the original solar system, average material. And interestingly, am I getting behind time? Give me a nudge if I'm... No? So just say one last thing, that astronomers today can see stars forming through the telescopes. And what happens is this: a huge cloud of gas and dust in the galaxy becomes gravitationally unstable and starts to collapse in on itself. And where the material comes together to form a central mass, that forms a new star. But as it does so, the angular momentum is maintained, and so a disk of material is spun out around that new star. And that disk eventually becomes planets. So that's the story. Okay, so what's interesting about meteorites is that they come from asteroids. Asteroids are small planets. They represent an early stage, before the Earth had finished growing to its full size, an early stage of these small planets that were going around the sun. So when we look at them, we're going right back to the very beginning, the first 5 million years, as Eva said, of the solar system when these things were doing their thing. Okay, so that brings me to the next question of when did this happen? When did this collapse and formation of the planets get underway? Well, the answer, I'm going to give you the answer first and then explain briefly, if I still have time, how we know. The answer is 4,567 million years. It's a very convenient number. Students love numbers like that because they're easy to remember, like pin numbers. You know? So 4,567 million years ago, this event happened. There was a collapse and the formation of a disk around the sun, and over the next 5 million years or so, it aggregated and eventually became the planets, as I said. So how do we know this? Well, it's based on radioactivity. Uranium is one of the natural elements. It's everywhere in small amounts, and it changes very, very slowly through time into lead. This is what radioactivity is, where one element changes into another element. So uranium changes into lead. Well, some of the bits in the meteorite there's an unusual kind of bit, but they're quite well known. They're called calcium aluminium rich inclusions, these rocky bits. Those are interesting because they contain uranium, but at the time they formed, they didn't contain any lead. These were molten, they were very hot, lead boils off. So the lead would have all boiled off and just have uranium in them. Well, if we look at them today, we find they've got a fair amount of lead. So that lead has come from the uranium by radioactive decay. So if we can measure the amount of lead today, which we can do, and the amount of uranium that's still there, and our physicist friends have done wonderful experiments to measure the rate at which the uranium changes into the lead, put that all together, you can calculate how long ago it was when there was no lead, the beginning, when these things were formed. And that's the 4,567 million years. And just to wrap up, I'm sure my 10 minutes is well over.
Well, you've got a few other objects, I think, to show us.
Well, yeah? They're just spares in case I finish too early. But
that was never going to happen.
but I just think you need to know about radioactivity. If I can find this. Yes, okay. This is a little crystal I brought along with me of uranium oxide, okay? And this is a Geiger counter. And if I just hold it up, can you hear clicks? Yeah. Not many. That's background. God, it's a much cleaner place than my office. Anyway, there's the odd click. There's radioactivity everywhere. But if I put this little crystal of uranium oxide near the detector, can you hear those? each little click is a dying atom, an atom of uranium that's changing into lead. And each time it does that, it gives out a little bit of energy and a little click. And that's how they measure the rate at which one changes to the other, incidentally. OK, so there they are, clicking away. And you might ask, well, how is it that they haven't all clicked away and gone long ago at that speed? Here, racing away. Well, the reason that there's still plenty of uranium left is that that little tiny crystal I worked out, back of the envelope kind of calculation, has got about 10 to the power of 22 atoms in it, atoms of uranium in that little. That's a lot of atoms. That's 10,000 billion atoms just in that. Atoms are very, very small. So they're ticking away all the time, changing to lead, one by one, clicking up the lead, and that allows us to measure the age. So that's how we know.
That's beautiful, thank you.
So am I off? I think my time must be up.
Unfortunately.
Right, that's great. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. So this is very easy for me. I just have to sit here and listen as enwrapped as the rest of you. So our next speaker this evening is Professor Nicola Marples, who works in zoology here, and she's very interested in evolution and particularly how behaviour has an impact on evolution. So Nicola, where do we start?
Well, what I decided to do, because life began with bacteria, is I decided that I'd illustrate evolution with objects, and the first object is me. Because,
Wonderful object.
In fact, I'm not a bacterium, but there are more cells of bacteria in my body than there are human cells in my body. And you needn't feel too smug, because that's true of you too. So, as an illustration of bacteria, the human body is a good example, and any other animal. Bacteria are absolutely everywhere. There's millions and millions of them. And we don't see them because they're so small. They're just a layer over everything. They were the very first life, and way back in about, not long after the Earth was formed, in fact. We don't actually have rocks old enough to show us the very beginnings of life. The rocks that are still around show evidence of life. So right back at the beginning, it was just bacteria. So they floated around in the sea, not on the land at all, just in the sea, because at that point there was no atmosphere, there was no oxygen, there was nothing to protect us from the UV light from the sun. So the only place that life could survive was in the water. They floated around for a very long time, until about 1,500 million years ago. So from 4,000 million years ago to 1,500 million years ago, so about 2/3 of the whole of the history of life is spent just being a tiny little cell floating in the sea.
And that leads us to the rock.
It leads us to the rock. I'll get the rock. So the next stage in the evolution of life, I've chosen to illustrate with lichens. Now, lichens tend to grow on rocks, and I'm not sure whether you can see. Can you see that bit is a little bit paler than the rest? That's because on the surface of the rock is growing a lichen. Lichen is a life form, but it's a very interesting life form because it's made up both of fungi and of a particular bacterium. And they both live together, kind of intertwined with each other. And that gives us two of the next steps to the evolution of life. The first one is sticking cells together. So I said that about 1,500 million years ago, they invented sticking cells together, and one of the groups that did that were the fungi. So the lichen is an example of somebody inventing that. But the bacteria are even more important because the bacteria are cyanobacteria. And those are the first bacteria that invented photosynthesis. Photosynthesis means making oxygen, taking carbon dioxide and water and making oxygen. And I said at the beginning of life, we couldn't go onto the land, nothing could go onto the land, because there was no oxygen, and the UV light beat down and just fried anything that went anywhere near it. So life had to cower in the sea, keeping well away from the sun. The cyanobacteria came along, sat on the surface of the sea, producing oxygen, creating us an atmosphere that can protect us from the UV. The other really important thing about not having any oxygen is you have to be very small because you really can't get very much energy from your respiration. So until oxygen came along, we had to stay as kind of flat sheets, just the animals, the beasts of that time were just flat sheets either lying on the surface of the sea or on the bottom of the sea or across rocks, just as flat sheets. Nothing else existed yet.
So then we could get bigger.
When we could get bigger. Next object. Next object, we've got a lot bigger.
So this is amazing. You've got to tell us about this.
Have you any idea what that is? I'm sure you do. You're allowed to own up that you know what it is.
I'm allowed. Okay. It's a shark jaw.
It is. How many of you saw it inside Trinity last night? Because it featured in that as well. This is a shark jaw just to illustrate the idea of jaws. Remember that at the moment we're still as flat plates lying on surfaces. Somebody, somewhere, invented the idea of eating the guy next to him. So it went along, and at that point it was just raspers, and they rasped away at the guy next to them and damaged him and got a free meal. From that flowed more complex jaws. They got little round jaws that kind of bored into the guy next to them. And from that point, they invented really proper jaws, chomping people around the place, or individuals around the place. And that step forward of jaws made a huge difference. Everything changed, because now you aren't all living in lovely harmony in the Garden of Eden. You're now eating each other, and so it's then worth. There's then a selective pressure that leads to the idea that running away might be a good move. So anybody that invented legs suddenly did really well. So legs got invented. Anyone who looked around and saw danger coming did very well. So eyes got invented. Having hard parts on the outside to stop everybody killing you became invented, and that's great because that meant lots more fossils got formed, because fossils get formed from hard parts. So you suddenly had this change from everybody looking boring and flat to loads of different body plans and arms and legs and heads and nervous systems and all sorts of things going on. That's called the Cambrian explosion, and very suddenly in the fossil record you go from boring, 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 nothing much going on, everything being invented, which was great. So the jaw is there to give you an example of the big step forward that made everything else happen. Because as soon as you start eating people, then they have to run away, basically.
But you brought another object for us.
I've brought one more object. I'll pass this round. I'll let you pass it round just so that you can look carefully at the rows of teeth and the complexity of those teeth. Because jaws got really clever, and particularly sharks have rows of teeth that as soon as you break one tooth off, the next one flips up in the way. But anyway, I mustn't get distracted or I won't get through the
But it does look beautiful. They look like they've been glued in there by somebody trying to decorate the skull. The way they're arranged, it's beautiful. So here you've got
Okay, so we've now
something closer to home.
We've left to something very much closer to home. Because I don't have time to give you all the stages, we now have to jump massively forward. So we've invented fish. Everything's got bigger because the oxygen's there. Started eating each other, got all the limbs and arms and sense organs, but we're still in the sea. At some point, one of those fish discovered, evolved, happened upon getting out of the sea. And that happened for two groups. It happened for things that were crabs, crustaceans, and they came out and made the insects. And it happened for the fish, and they came out and made the amphibians and then the reptiles. You all know about reptiles. Reptiles turned eventually into dinosaurs, or at least some lines of them did. Can I give you that while I sit up, because otherwise I'm going to be semi on this the whole time. That's better. So we've now got reptiles running about, we've got dinosaurs running about, but among the feet of the dinosaurs is another two groups that started at that point. One of them was the birds that were slowly inventing flying, and one of them was the mammals. The mammals were at the beginning kind of little shrew-type things, but gradually they started using all these different habitats and spread out, and eventually one of those lines became what we would think of as the primates. So they invented basically being very unspecialized. They were good at climbing in trees, they were good at eating fruit, they were quite good at catching a few little bits of meat here and there, But they weren't very fast, and they weren't very aggressive, and they weren't very anything. The only thing they were very was clever. If you take a primate skull, and this is a chimp skull, you can see that the eyes are quite big, but not enormous. The jaws are pretty big, but not enormous. There aren't huge, sharp teeth. But there is an enormously bigger bigger skull than any other group of animals would have. And that's because their specialization was thinking. And they became a social animals thinking their way around problems. Eventually, one of those groups came back down out of the trees, got even bigger and got even cleverer, and that was the great apes. One of those species started being so clever that they could control their environment. They could invent language and speak to each other so as to be able to work together better, but they could also, they also did invent having dwellings and having clothing on so that they weren't as cold in the winter and they could adjust their environment. They invented farming so that they could make food rather than having to go around and chase it. And gradually, they became better and better at controlling their environment and controlling everything around them. That was very successful, and it is very successful. We're still here, but we're here in such great numbers that now we have another big problem, which is how to control that controlling of the environment, how to make sure that we can actually maintain an environment with anybody else in it at all. So we've ended up with one more problem to solve that we know about, and there'll be some ahead of that, which we need to use our special skill, which is brains, yes, to get round.
Yes. Well, thank you, Nicola. Well done on starting and ending with yourself in form of human. But thank you very much. Well, this leads on very naturally and very nicely to our next talk, which is from Professor Dan Bradley, who's in the genetics department here in Trinity, along with me. And he's going to talk to us about human evolution. So this, picking up where Nicola has just left off.
Yes, literally picking up. Nicola very kindly loaned me this prop here. So it's great to be here. It's a bit like the starting music in the Big Bang Theory, where it goes all the way from the Big Bang to Neanderthals, and here we are now. So I will talk about Neanderthals. So the skull is a nice prop for what we do, because what we do in my lab is we extract DNA from ancient specimens. So rather than trying to figure out what happened in the past by looking at patterns in DNA, we go right to the past and extract DNA. And the best place to get DNA from ancient specimens, because usually it's very degraded and very poor quality, is a little bit of the skull just in there. So we work in humans and cattle and sheep and goats. Oh dear, I've broken this. Oh, is it?
Expert handling.
So, literally, this talk is bookended with another one coming afterwards on manuscripts, and that's interesting because the other items that we extract DNA from the past from, sort of time traveling with DNA, is from ancient manuscripts, where we can use a technique where we can extract DNA from the cattle, sheep, and goat that they're made from. So I'll say something about humans.
Yeah, so tell us a bit about maybe the first humans.
Yeah, and where we come from. So I'll talk a bit about DNA later on, but to start with, I'll talk about morphology. And humans, as Nicola mentioned, we emerge from the higher primates. And if one went back to Africa 5 million years ago, we start to branch off from our cousins here, from the chimpanzees, who are our closest relatives, and things begin to change. So through Africa, through our African journey over that 5 million years, a few things happen. One thing is we start to stand up more tall. We start to free up our hands for use, for using tools. Chimps use tools, but we use tools in a much more creative way. Chimps don't change their tools in a way that you could recognize archaeologically. Something like 3 million years ago, humans start to change tools so that we can look at them and say, that was a tool. It wasn't just a rock. It was a tool. It was changed for a particular purpose. It was sharpened or whatever. And tools get progressively more complex as time goes on. But what happens is our skulls grow. and become more globular, and our heads become larger. At the same time, this bit here at the side, which contains the muscles for our jaws, becomes much smaller. Our jaws become much less powerful, and we don't need as much power in our jaws because the food we're eating becomes more refined and less rough. It doesn't have to be, torn apart in the same way. The face becomes less protruding. So, and what happens is our ancestors went into a virtuous cycle where the brains got larger, they got smarter, they became better hunters. As they became better hunters, they got better quality food, which was able to feed this very, very hungry organ, this energy hungry organ called the brain. So we had this cycle, and it led to the most amazing feature perhaps in the whole of the biological universe, which I think is the human brain. Now, it isn't a simple linear story. Evolution never is, because there were many different types of humans. If you time traveled back even only something like 50,000 years, you'll find various different types of humans and human-like species on the planet. And they met each other. And the question is, and we're the only one that survives. We're the only one that made it. But we really did make it, because there's 7 billion of us alive today. And there's only some tens of thousands alive of some of our cousins. So the bush of the human evolutionary tree, the diversity there, it was all present until recently. And where did it go? And do we come from many of those bushes? Like, for example, do humans in Europe, do we come from a type of human that used to live in Europe called Neanderthal, which is somewhat different from us, certainly at a different culture? Do humans in Asia come from different types of archaic human types that live there? Or an alternative theory is, do we all have a relatively close ancestry in a single type of human that evolved in Africa, something like just over 150,000 years ago, and then swept through the whole world, replacing those different types that were there before? So which is it? And this is where DNA comes in, because when you sequence human DNA, and when you sequence DNA from these different types of relatives, for example, Neanderthals, you find that we're all very closely related, and they are quite distant cousins. So we swept through the continent and or through the world, replacing what was there before.
But a little bit of mingling.
But a little bit of mingling happened, exactly. So when the first Neanderthal was sequenced, about 10 years ago, it was found that there were some parts of Neanderthal that were very similar to some parts of many humans. And actually, when you look at humans around the world today, about 2% of humans outside Africa have their heritage coming from Neanderthals. And there's another type of archaic human called Denisovans, and all we know about that is from a tooth in a cave in Siberia. It's been sequenced, and it's another type of archaic human, which has contributed some 2 to 4% of ancestry to people who live in Australia, and somewhat less to people who live in East Asia today. So the human tree is very much to do with a rapid out of Africa exodus, but it's a little more complex than that. There's some things went on there 40, 50,000 years ago that have left their mark today.
So, but what about Irish people in particular? Have you got any Irish samples? Or
Yeah. So we've been working on ancient DNA, and our human ancient DNA is focused on Ireland and other European specimens. And the story of Europe, and Nicola mentioned this, is that we had people here initially. They were hunter-gatherer people who just lived off the land, mainly ate fish and gathered various vegetables. And there weren't that many of them. Then there was another big bang, which was agriculture, which happened in the Fertile Crescent in the Near East. And that spread into Europe, allowing many more people to live and being much more efficient about producing food. And then even after that, there was another big change, and that was the first metal use, particularly bronze. Bronze, if you think of it, the world was grey. it was full of grey stone, and then all of a sudden this golden metal, which made new tools, which conferred status on people who owned it, it became a currency. And the great conundrum in thinking about the past in archaeology was, whenever these changes happen, did they happen with people moving, or were just the ideas moving? And if you go back to about the time of the Second World War, people really thought it was superior people moving, displacing what was there before. And then when it came to the 60s, we had a more sort of San Francisco view of the world, where nobody moved and everybody just helped each other along and said, here's a new technology, why don't you run with it and see how it goes? And the great question was there migration in the past, or was there not? What do you think? Do you think humans migrated in the past or not? Yeah, well, if you look at history, look at the New World. People aren't descended largely from the Native Americans who used to live in eastern USA anymore. And that's what we find when we look at ancient DNA. If you look at, we've sequenced one skeleton from Ballynahattie, from Giant's Ring, just outside Belfast. That's an early farmer. And a few from Rathlin, from the island just off Antrim coast. And that's from the Bronze Age. And what we find in both cases, there's been massive replacement. That the population has suffered huge migrations into it. And if you ask, who are we today? Well, we're a mix, of course, but largely the population is defined by those metal workers who came in about 4,000 years ago.
And so at the beginning you mentioned manuscripts and using ancient manuscripts, and this would lead nicely into our next talk as well. So what have you done with the manuscripts? Yeah,
so the great question when you're working with ancient DNA, trying to get right back to the past and observe it directly, is to get good material to work with. Now, bones can be good, but most often they're not. Manuscripts are made of animal skins, because we work with cattle, sheep and goat bones as well. And they are carefully preserved, dried and lovingly kept artifacts. So the DNA is really well preserved in them. And really it's not good to go cutting piece off valuable manuscripts. So we can get enough DNA by using rubber, and which is used often to clean manuscripts anyway. And we find two things. First of all, we find, for our studies in cattle, sheep and goats, we find cattle, sheep and goat DNA, and that's a whole other story for another day. But also sometimes we find human DNA, that the people have been thumbing those manuscripts. They've left
so monk DNA.
Maybe monk DNA, or it might be curator DNA, or it might be student DNA. And sometimes you find bacteria as well. You find acne bacteria. So people have been scratching themselves over the centuries. So
what's your pitch to get access to a little bit of the Book of Kells?
I wouldn't start with the Book of Kells. I'd start with something a little more humble. Okay, so maybe that would be my pitch.
Maybe they'll let you in. Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dan. That was very interesting. So this leads perfectly to our fourth and final talk of this evening. And so Jane Maxwell is a manuscripts curator here in Trinity. Maybe you can let Dan have access to the Book of Kells. And Jane's going to tell us about what stories an artefact can tell us.
Well, I'd like to start by saying that, there is no such thing as history. That's the story. There are histories. And that's where curators come in. Because regardless of what you want to study, you have to have the evidence. History is like science and literature. It's like telling you a story, but I want you to believe it, so I have to have evidence. When people say, what's the difference between, the human and the animal, there are many, many answers to that. Is it a sense of humor? Is it using tools or whatever? One of the differences is telling stories. That's what history is, except you have to have evidence. So the manuscripts that Dan was talking about and the books that you're surrounded with here, these are all the evidence. And curators, their first responsibility is to make sure that the next generation of historians comes and finds evidence. So I haven't got an artifact for you today, because the kinds of materials that I handle on a day-to-day basis, they don't take very much rough handling. They're not very robust. So if you want to come and look at this kind of material, you have to have a good reason. You know, you have to have done your preparation, because our first responsibility is to the evidence, and not to you as a historian, but to you as one of a continuum of historians who've used this material, and the future historians' access to it is as important to me and to us as your own. So one of the things I'd like you to think about is the fact that history changes. And the reason it changes is because you as a historian, you find the history you go looking for. Okay? So in the 20th century, histories tended to be, I think, one of the new crop of TV historians has referred to rather disparagingly as big books about battles by blokes, you know, and that was 20th century history. And one of the even in this library, you can see an example of how things have changed. James Ussher, some of you will know James Ussher, is one of the founding fathers of this library. When the James Ussher Library arrived in here, it included 10,000 manuscripts that formed the basis of the manuscript collection that I work with. And the printed aspect, the printed part of his library still exists right here behind you, as he kept it. And interestingly enough, the next chap who donated his library donated it on the understanding, on the promise several centuries ago, that it would remain beside James Ussher's library. But James Ussher is famous for saying that the world began, you know, something like 2,000 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon, okay? Because the methods that he used made perfect sense at the time. If you believed that the Bible, if you believed the Bible, and you did believe the Bible, you simply counted the patriarchs' ages. Now, you don't just... Sorry.
You got it to 6,000. Yeah,
6,000
so 4,000 years before Christ.
Yeah.
So it was 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning.
More or less, yeah, after coffee, you know. But it made perfect sense. He was a deadly serious person, and he didn't just go and get your average Bible and go, you know, this chap was 147, this chap was 492. He bought or he commissioned the oldest biblical text that he could, the Syrian, the Greek, the Latin, and he counted up from there. So we don't do that anymore. So if I had brought you an artifact today, it would have been something which illustrates a change in historiography that I myself find very interesting, and that is the impact on the writing of history of the ideological history of women. So if you go looking for the history of women, you change all of history. Because, for example, can you say anything about the Renaissance if it didn't impact on 50% of your people? So if you're 13 years old, female, and 1 year away from death by pregnancy, does it matter who is painting the Sistine Chapel? It kind of doesn't, you know. So one of the artifacts we have in the Manuscripts and Archives department, which is in this actual building, is it's a memoir by a woman from Tipperary called Dorothea Herbert. She was born, like, she likes to fudge her birth date. I think she was 18 for about 37 years. But she was born in Tipperary. She was born in the late 18th century and died in about at the age of 67. Now, it has been generally known to history for quite a while, and up until relatively recently, because she was from Tipperary, and Tipperary is where the white boy land agitation kicked off in Ireland, she doesn't mention it. Okay, she doesn't mention that. So therefore, because political history has really taken over the narrative of Irish history for quite a long time, her memoir was dismissed as being just gossip. And the other thing is that she had a mental illness. Now, I don't know anything more than any other layperson about mental illness, but I understand that if you have a particular kind of mental illness, it tends to express itself according to the cultural norms through which you're living. So for an 18th century young woman, you had to get married to enter into adult life. So she became obsessed with one of her neighbours, and she believed that he had promised to marry her. And because her memoir was A, not sufficiently political, and B, crazy lady stalks man kind of thing, it was sidelined. It was nothing. Nowadays, of course, it's completely changed. You don't go to a memoir like that looking for political history. You go looking to see how this particular woman dealt with a mental illness at a time when, you wouldn't believe how mental patients were treated. One of the things that it was considered to be a good idea to treat somebody with an obsession was that you put them into a sort of a mechanical chair and whirl them around like this to scare the demons out of them. So, you know, but Dorothea Herbert used literature to control her symptoms, to explain them, because romantic fiction had become a big thing in late 18th century Ireland. So she expressed herself in the tones of a romantic heroine. And so she wrote her memoir so that her family would stop locking her up in her bedroom and thinking she was crazy. And she expressed it, and she probably knew that this man had nothing to do with her, but she needed to explain to her family things they had seen her do that were out of the ordinary and unorthodox. So she explained it in high drama. So literary scholars look at this memoir and understand that this woman used a very sophisticated strategy for a woman who was educated. You know, she was taught to read and write, and then any visitor who came to the house might give her a book. That was her education. She was clearly really gifted. And she really made a sophisticated use of romantic literature to establish herself, to maintain her reputation within her family, you know. So that is why, if I had an artifact to bring you, that is what I bring you, because you find the history you go looking for, and if you reject something because it doesn't tell you a story, that does not mean it's not evidence in somebody else's story. So curators think about future historians. And if I'm fascinated by Dorothea Herbert, you might be fascinated by something completely different. She might be talking about dresses. You might be interested in her library. You know, you might be interested in the way she stitched her book together to make it look like it was a published book. So, like Dan was saying, you look at a manuscript and you might read the text, but you might actually be looking for DNA. I've been here a long number of years. I remember when microfilming texts was supposed to be the answer to public access. Well, microfilm of the Book of Kells is not going to tell you anything about the DNA of the monk that was, you know, thumbing through it. Every generation has a different question. So the curator's job is to make sure that the next generation gets to answer the question, and we don't just provide you with microfilms or, you know, say a lack of care has let things slip away that you as the next generation of historians might find invaluable. So that's what we do.
That's beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think that was just about a perfect end for this event. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for your attention throughout this. I want to say a big thank you to Sean O'Boyle for organising this event, in case he's somewhere within earshot. He's been working for Science Gallery for 6 years, and this is his last day. So we're going to miss you, Sean. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening wandering around Trinity and finding your own little artefacts that are going to make you start thinking. Thank you.